There is a strange reaction that happens when the human mind encounters something too unbelievable. It does not investigate. It does not analyze. It rejects, not because the information is false, but because it feels wrong. Modern thinking has trained us to trust patterns, logic, and probability. If something sounds impossible, we instinctively label it as fiction, a hoax, an exaggeration, something invented for attention. We scroll past it, close the tab, and move on. But history does not care what sounds believable. History is not written to make sense to the future. It is written by people living in moments where logic had not yet been refined, where systems were fragile, and where reality often unfolded in ways that defy modern expectation. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because there are events in history that are not myths, not legends, not folklore passed down through unreliable storytelling. They are documented, recorded, witnessed, analyzed by historians. And yet, they sound fake. So fake that if you type them into a search engine today, your instinct might be to doubt the result, to assume the source is unreliable, to think that context is missing, to suspect exaggeration. But there is no exaggeration. These things happened. Entire cities behaved in ways that make no psychological sense today. Governments made decisions that seem absurd in hindsight. Societies accepted realities that modern minds struggle to process. Not because people were foolish, but because they were human. We often imagine the past as a place of simplicity, of slower lives, of straightforward cause and effect. But the truth is more unsettling. The past was complex, unstable, and often irrational. Human behavior did not follow clean narratives. It followed fear, curiosity, pressure, belief, and sometimes it followed nothing at all. There are moments in history where thousands of people acted together without understanding why, where laws were applied to the dead, where wars ended almost as soon as they began, where entire populations experienced sensations that had no physical source. These events do not fit comfortably into textbooks. They are too strange, too awkward, too disruptive to neat explanations. So they are often simplified, minimized, or quietly ignored, not because they are unimportant, but because they challenge our sense of control. Modern society is built on the belief that progress moves forward, that knowledge accumulates, that irrationality fades over time, that we are less likely to repeat the mistakes of the past because we understand them. But these stories suggest something else. They suggest that human behavior is not linear, that under certain conditions, even advanced societies can behave in ways that feel surreal, chaotic, and deeply irrational, that intelligence does not guarantee reason, that structure does not eliminate absurdity. And that belief, once shared by enough people, can overpower evidence. The most disturbing part is not what happened. It is how normal it felt at the time. The people involved did not wake up thinking they were part of something unbelievable. They were following rules, customs, and expectations that made sense within their world. They trusted authority. They trusted tradition. They trusted the collective. And because everyone else seemed to accept it, doubt felt unnecessary. This is how the strangest events become possible, not through madness, but through agreement. History shows us that reality is fragile when enough people decide to interpret it the same way. That truth can be bent by context, that what feels absurd today may have felt inevitable yesterday. These stories are uncomfortable because they do not offer clean explanations. Historians can describe what happened, but not always why. Evidence exists, but meaning remains uncertain, and uncertainty is something the modern mind dislikes. We prefer answers, causes, conclusions, but the past does not always provide them. Sometimes it offers only questions. Why did this happen? Why did no one stop it? Why did it feel acceptable? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, would we have acted differently? It is easy to judge the past with modern eyes, to laugh at decisions that seem ridiculous now, to assume that education or technology would have prevented such events. History repeatedly shows us otherwise. Under the right conditions, logic bends, fear spreads, curiosity overrides caution, authority silences doubt, and belief becomes more powerful than evidence. These are not flaws of ancient minds, they are features of human nature. The stories you are about to hear were once real experiences lived by real people. They had families, responsibilities, social pressures. They made choices within systems that rewarded conformity and punished resistance. And when something strange happened, they did not question reality itself. They adapted to it. That adaptability is what allowed humanity to survive, but it is also what allowed humanity to normalize the unbelievable. As you listen, you may feel disbelief. You may feel discomfort. You may feel the urge to pause and verify what you are hearing. That reaction is natural. It is the same reaction people have always had when confronted with truths that do not align with expectation. But remember this, reality does not require our approval. History is full of events that sound like fiction because fiction is shaped by logic and narrative. History is shaped by people, and people are unpredictable. These stories are not here to shock you. They are here to remind you that truth is often stranger than invention. That disbelief is not proof of falsehood, and that sometimes the most unsettling things are real precisely because no one believed they could happen. So as we begin with the first story, let go of the need for everything to make sense immediately. Listen not as a skeptic looking for flaws, but as a witness encountering something unfamiliar. Because the past is not obligated to feel reasonable. And the moment you assume that something sounds too strange to be true, history has already proven you wrong. The city that danced until people died. The morning began like any other. Shops opened. Bells rang. People stepped into the streets expecting an ordinary day. No announcements were made. No warnings were given. Nothing suggested that by nightfall something impossible would have unfolded. Then one person began to dance. At first it looked harmless. A man moving strangely in the street, his body swaying without music, his steps uneven and erratic. Some thought he was drunk. Others laughed. A few ignored him entirely. But he did not stop. Hours passed. His movements became frantic, his breathing heavy. Sweat soaked his clothes, still he continued. When his legs trembled and buckled, he forced himself upright again. When pain should have ended it, it didn't. And then something far stranger happened. Another person joined. Not as a joke, not as imitation, as if compelled. Their movements were similar, uncontrolled, urgent. Soon a third followed. Then a fourth. By the end of the day, dozens of people were dancing in the streets, their bodies locked into motion they could not explain. There was no music, there was no celebration, there was no clear reason. This was not performance, this was not ritual, this was something else entirely. Over the following days, the number grew. Hundreds of people danced without rest. Some screamed in agony while moving. Others cried, some laughed hysterically. Many begged for help while their bodies continued to twist and sway against their will. They danced until their feet bled. They danced until muscles tore. They danced until hearts failed, and some of them died. This event, documented by witnesses and records, took place in 1518 in the city of Strasbourg. It is often referred to as the Dancing Plague, and it remains one of the most baffling mass behavior events in recorded history. What makes this story so unsettling is not just what happened, but how people responded. Authorities did not stop it. They encouraged it. Physicians at the time believed the dancers were suffering from overheated blood. Their solution was not rest, but movement. They thought the only cure was to dance the sickness out of the body. So they built stages, they hired musicians, they cleared spaces for people to continue dancing. The logic was horrifyingly simple. If dancing caused the problem, dancing would solve it. And so the city helped it spread. As more people joined, fear began to ripple through the population. Families watched loved ones lose control of their bodies. Priests prayed. Doctors argued. Officials debated. No one had an answer. Some blamed divine punishment. Others blamed poisoned food. A few suspected mass hysteria. But none of these explanations could stop what was happening in front of them. People were not pretending. Their pain was real. Their exhaustion was visible. Their inability to stop was undeniable. Records describe dancers collapsing, only to rise again moments later. Some reportedly danced for days without sleep. Witnesses described faces frozen in expressions of terror as bodies continued to move. This was not joy. It was compulsion. The most disturbing detail is how quickly it became normal. At first, people gathered out of curiosity, then out of concern, eventually out of habit. The sight of dancing bodies became part of the city's daily rhythm. Life continued around it. Markets operated. Children played nearby. Death became background noise. This normalization is what makes the event truly frightening. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, even to horror. When something unexplainable persists long enough, people stop asking why and start asking how to live alongside it. Eventually, after weeks, the dancing faded. As suddenly as it began, it ended. Survivors were left weakened, traumatized, and confused. Bodies bore permanent damage. Memories haunted those who watched. No definitive explanation was ever found. Modern theories range from psychological stress to environmental toxins. Some suggest ergot poisoning. Others argue mass psychogenic illness. Each explanation explains part of the story, but none fully satisfy it. Because no theory can easily explain why entire communities move together without coordination. Why did people join instead of flee? Why did authorities enable it? Why did fear not stop it? The answer may lie in the conditions of the time. Europe was under immense strain, famine, disease, religious pressure, economic uncertainty. Life was rigid, controlled, and stressful. Emotional release was rare. In such an environment, something broke. And when it broke, it spread. Humans are deeply social creatures. We mirror behavior unconsciously. Emotion travels through observation. When one person reacts intensely, others feel it. In tightly connected communities, this effect amplifies. Once enough people were dancing, stopping became psychologically difficult. To stand still was to feel isolated. To join was to belong. Belonging often feels safer than logic. This story unsettles us because it strips away the illusion of control. It shows that under certain conditions, rational behavior can dissolve quickly, that the mind is not always sovereign over the body, that groups can move without direction. It also forces us to confront an uncomfortable thought. If you had lived there, surrounded by suffering neighbors, trusted authorities, and shared fear, would you have acted differently? Would you have resisted? Or would you have found yourself moving, unable to explain why? The dancing plague was not a hoax. It was not exaggerated. It was real enough to kill. And it stands as a reminder that history is filled with events that sound fictional, because fiction assumes coherence. Reality does not. This story is not about medieval ignorance. It is about human vulnerability, about how stress, belief, and social pressure can combine into something uncontrollable. And this is only the first story, because history holds many truths that feel too strange to accept. Not because they are false, but because they expose how fragile our sense of normal really is. And once that fragility is revealed, it cannot be unseen. When the dead were put on trial. The idea sounds absurd the moment you hear it. A courtroom prepared, judges seated, witnesses summoned, a verdict read aloud. All of this carried out with full seriousness under the authority of law. The only problem was this: the defendant was already dead. Not metaphorically, not legally, physically dead, and yet the trial proceeded. In the Middle Ages, law was not only a system of order, it was a reflection of belief. Justice was not just about correcting behavior. It was about restoring balance to the world. And sometimes that balance demanded accountability even beyond death. There were moments in history when people truly believed that a crime did not disappear just because the criminal no longer breathed. Guilt in their minds could linger, and unresolved guilt was dangerous. It threatened moral order. So they put the dead on trial. One of the most infamous cases occurred in the 9th century. A pope had died, not quietly but controversially. His reign had been divisive, his decisions questioned, his authority disputed. When his successor took power, dissatisfaction did not fade with the funeral. It intensified. Instead of allowing history to judge the former pope, the new authority made a different choice. The corpse was exhumed. The body, already decaying, was dressed in papal robes. It was placed upright on a throne. And then the trial began. A deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the corpse. Charges were read aloud. Accusations echoed through the chamber. The dead pope was accused of violating sacred law, of abusing power, of holding office illegitimately. Witnesses spoke. Judges listened. The body did not respond. It did not need to. The verdict had already been decided. The pope was found guilty. His papal vestments were stripped away. His acts were declared void. His authority erased retroactively. Even his fingers, the ones used to bless and ordain, were cut off as symbolic punishment. After the trial, the body was thrown into a river. This event, recorded in historical sources, is often called the Cadaver Synod. It is tempting to dismiss it as madness, as a single moment of insanity in a chaotic time. But it was not unique. Across medieval Europe, animals were put on trial. Pigs that killed children, rats accused of destroying crops, insects charged with devastation. Courts issued summons, lawyers argued cases, verdicts were delivered. Sometimes animals were executed, sometimes they were excommunicated. The logic behind these trials was not irrational within the worldview of the time. Law was seen as universal. If animals and humans lived within God's creation, they were subject to divine order. When something violated that order, it had to be addressed formally. Otherwise, chaos would spread. Trials served a purpose beyond justice. They reassured communities that control still existed, that authority still functioned, that misfortune had meaning. When tragedy struck, people needed structure. And structure came in the form of ritualized law. Putting the dead or the voiceless on trial transformed helplessness into action. It gave people something to do with their fear, anger, and confusion. Instead of asking why something happened, they asked who was responsible, even if that responsibility had to be assigned symbolically. What makes these trials so disturbing is not their outcome, but the seriousness with which they were conducted. There was no irony, no acknowledgement of absurdity. Everyone involved believed the process mattered. The dead defendant was treated as if it could still affect the living world. This belief reveals something essential about human psychology. People struggle with unresolved narratives. Death feels unfinished when accountability is missing. Without closure, discomfort lingers. Trials of the dead provided closure. They allowed communities to rewrite the past, to correct history, to symbolically undo harm. In the case of the dead pope, the trial was not about law alone. It was about power. By condemning the corpse, the new authority delegitimized the past. It erased inconvenient decisions. It reshaped memory. History was edited through ritual. This practice also highlights how dangerous belief can be when paired with authority. Once an idea is accepted collectively, even the most bizarre actions can feel justified. Exhuming a body for judgment sounds grotesque now, but at the time it was framed as necessary. Necessary to restore order, necessary to appease God, necessary to reassure the people. The trial was theater, but it was believed theater, and belief gives theater power. The same mechanism appears again and again throughout history. When people feel powerless, they gravitate toward symbolic acts, acts that feel decisive, acts that suggest control even when control is illusion. Law becomes performance, justice becomes narrative, and reality bends to fit expectation. These trials did not prevent future conflict. They did not solve underlying issues. But they offered emotional relief, a sense that something had been done, and sometimes that is enough to sustain a belief system. From a modern perspective, these events challenge our assumption that law is always rational, that justice is always grounded in practicality. In truth, law has often been shaped by fear, faith, and social pressure. The trial of the dead reveals how flexible human reasoning can become when certainty is threatened. It also forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When authority and belief align, logic becomes optional. We may think ourselves immune to such thinking today, but history suggests otherwise. Symbolic actions still dominate modern responses to fear. We still seek closure through gestures. We still punish symbols when problems feel too large to solve directly. The faces have changed. The instincts have not. The people who held these trials were not mocking justice. They were trying to preserve it, using the tools they understood. Their world made sense to them. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. Because it reminds us that reality is not defined by what makes sense, but by what people agree to treat as real. And once a society agrees that even the dead can be judged, the boundaries of reason become dangerously flexible. As we move forward, the next story will show us another example of how history can feel like fiction. A moment where decisions made in full seriousness produced results so brief, so abrupt that they feel like a joke. But the consequences were real. Because sometimes history does not unfold slowly. Sometimes it collapses in less than an hour. The war that ended before most people knew it began. At first, it does not even sound like a real war. There is no long buildup, no dramatic campaigns, no years of tension stretching across generations. When people hear about it, they often assume it must be exaggerated, misrecorded, or misunderstood. A war that lasted less than an hour? That sounds like a mistake. But it wasn't. On August 27, 1896, two sovereign powers officially went to war. Declarations were made, cannons were prepared, orders were given. Soldiers took positions, flags were raised, and before most people in the world even knew it had begun, it was already over. The Anglo-Zanzibar War is widely recognized as the shortest war in recorded history. From the first shot to the final surrender, it lasted somewhere between 38 and 45 minutes, depending on the source. Yet within that brief span of time, people were killed, buildings were destroyed, and the political fate of a nation was sealed. The war began with a succession crisis. In Zanzibar, a small but strategically important island off the coast of East Africa, the ruler had died suddenly. According to existing treaties, his successor required approval from British authorities, who exerted strong influence over the region. But one man refused to wait. He declared himself sultan without permission and took control of the palace. From his perspective, the decision was bold but justified. From the British perspective, it was unacceptable. Diplomacy followed briefly. The British issued an ultimatum: step down by a specific time or face military consequences. The deadline was precise, the language formal, the threat unmistakable. The new sultan did not comply. Perhaps he believed the British were bluffing. Perhaps he trusted the symbolic strength of sovereignty. Perhaps he underestimated the willingness of a global empire to enforce authority. Or perhaps he simply did not believe that history could move so quickly. At the appointed hour, British warships opened fire on the palace. The bombardment was overwhelming. Within minutes, the palace was in ruins. Fires spread, artillery smashed walls, defensive positions collapsed almost immediately. Zanzibar's forces attempted to respond, but their weapons were outdated, their positions exposed. The Sultan fled. By the time the smoke began to clear, the war was already ending. Casualties were dramatically unequal. On the British side, there was minimal loss. On the Zanzibar side, hundreds were killed or wounded. The palace, once a symbol of authority, lay shattered. Less than an hour after it began, the war was over. A new ruler, approved by the British, was installed. History moved on. What makes this story unsettling is not just its brevity, but how seriously it was conducted. This was not a skirmish. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a full military action carried out according to protocol with lethal force. It only feels absurd because of how quickly it concluded. We are accustomed to thinking of war as prolonged suffering. Endless campaigns, generations scarred. But history does not always conform to our expectations. Sometimes it moves with brutal efficiency. This war challenges our assumptions about power, agency, and resistance. The new sultan was not foolish. He understood symbolism. He understood authority. But he misjudged scale. In the late 19th century, global empires operated with a level of military dominance that left little room for negotiation. Resistance was not measured in courage, but in firepower. And firepower ended the conversation. The speed of the war did not make it less real for those who lived through it. People died. Families lost homes. A nation's autonomy was curtailed further. For the survivors, the memory was not humorous. It was traumatic. And yet, when told today, the story often becomes trivia. A curious fact, something mentioned for shock value. The shortest war in history. This framing strips away the human cost. It turns destruction into novelty. That is part of what makes the story fit so uneasily into modern understanding. It feels too neat, too compressed, too unbelievable, but that compression is precisely what makes it true. History does not wait for comprehension. The war also reveals how authority operates when challenged. The British response was not fueled by emotion or chaos. It was procedural, calm, systematic. This efficiency is unsettling in its own way. Violence did not erupt out of passion. It unfolded out of paperwork. Deadlines were set. Orders were executed. The outcome was predetermined. This kind of power does not feel dramatic. It feels inevitable, and inevitability is frightening. For the people of Zanzibar, the war reinforced a harsh reality. Sovereignty existed only within the boundaries allowed by greater forces. Defiance was symbolic, not strategic. The new sultan's act of resistance lasted less than an hour, but its consequences lasted decades. This story reminds us that not all historical tragedies are long and drawn out. Some happen so quickly that they barely register before they are over. Speed does not soften impact. It amplifies it. When something ends before you fully understand it has begun, there is no time for adjustment, no space for reflection, only aftermath. The Anglo-Zanzibar War also exposes how history is often remembered selectively. We focus on duration because it feels quantifiable. But duration does not measure significance. A single moment can alter the course of nations. A decision made in confidence can collapse in minutes. And power, when unevenly distributed, does not need time to assert itself. This war feels unreal because it contradicts narrative expectations. It does not allow for heroism. There is no prolonged resistance, no gradual turning point, just impact and silence. In that silence lies the true weight of the story. Not in how short the war was, but in how little chance there was for any other outcome. History does not always unfold dramatically. Sometimes it simply ends. As we move into the next story, the sense of disbelief will deepen, because the next event did not involve cannons or politics, but something far subtler. An entire city experienced something that could not be seen, could not be measured. And yet, everyone was certain it was real. They smelled it, and no one could explain where it came from. The day an entire city smelled something that didn't exist. At first, it sounded like a joke, the kind of rumor that spreads briefly before disappearing. Someone complained of a strange smell in the air. Others laughed. A few shrugged it off as imagination, but the smell did not go away. It grew stronger. And then something unsettling happened. More people began to notice it. Not just one neighborhood, not just a few individuals, entire streets reported the same thing. A foul, suffocating odor that seemed to appear without warning. It had no clear source, no visible smoke, no leaking pipes, no spoiled food, and yet people swore it was there. They described it differently, but with the same conviction. Some said it smelled like chemicals, others compared it to burning rubber. Some said it was metallic, others described something closer to decay. What united them was certainty. They were smelling something real. The event became known as one of the most bizarre mass sensory phenomena in history, sometimes referred to as a phantom odor outbreak. Entire cities reported it. Authorities investigated, scientists were called, instruments were deployed, nothing was found, no gas leaks, no industrial accidents, no environmental explanation. And yet, the complaints continued. People covered their faces, schools closed, businesses shut their doors, hospitals reported patients experiencing nausea, headaches, dizziness, and panic. The smell became oppressive, not because of its intensity, but because of its persistence. It followed people indoors, it lingered, and worst of all, it behaved inconsistently. Some people smelled it intensely, others standing beside them smelled nothing at all. Arguments broke out, accusations followed. Was it real? Was it imagined? Was someone exaggerating? The uncertainty made it worse. Authorities released statements urging calm. They reassured the public that no dangerous substance had been detected. Air quality tests came back normal. Medical experts suggested stress or anxiety might be involved. These explanations did not comfort anyone. In fact, they made people angrier. To those experiencing the smell, being told it was not real felt like dismissal, like being accused of hallucination. Their symptoms were undeniable. Their discomfort was physical. Something was wrong, and no one could explain it. Newspapers amplified the phenomenon. Headlines speculated wildly. Some suggested sabotage. Others hinted at secret experiments. Conspiracy theories spread rapidly. When official explanations failed, imagination stepped in. The smell became a symbol. It represented fear of the unseen, of threats that could not be detected by normal means, of dangers that science could not immediately name. This fear fed on itself. The more people talked about the smell, the more people noticed it. The more they noticed it, the more real it became. Panic heightened sensitivity. Every unfamiliar sensation was interpreted as confirmation. Human perception is not neutral. It is influenced by expectation. Once the idea of the smell took hold, minds searched for it. And when you search for something intensely enough, you often find it. This is not because people were lying. It is because the brain fills gaps. Smell is particularly vulnerable to this. It is closely linked to memory and emotion. Fear can amplify perception. Stress can create physical sensations that feel external. But explaining this does not make the experience less real to those affected. People were suffering. Some fled the city, others demanded action. Local officials faced pressure to do something, anything, even without evidence. The absence of a visible cause made the situation feel uncontrollable. And humans struggle deeply with uncontrollable threats. History shows that when people cannot see danger, they often imagine it everywhere. This phenomenon did not occur in isolation. Similar outbreaks have been recorded across different times and places. Mass reports of strange tastes in water, sounds no one else could hear, sensations that spread socially rather than physically. These events are often grouped under the concept of mass psychogenic illness, but that term, while clinical, feels insufficient. It suggests imagination, but imagination alone does not cause nausea, vomiting, fainting, or pain. What happens instead is a complex interaction between stress, belief, and physiology. The body responds to perceived threat even when the threat is not material. The response is genuine. The suffering is real. And once it begins, it can spread rapidly. In the case of the phantom odor, the outbreak eventually faded. Not because the source was found, but because attention shifted. Fear moved elsewhere. The collective focus dissolved. As suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. No residue remained. No explanation satisfied everyone. For some, the experience remained traumatic. They remembered the smell vividly long after it was gone. For others, it became an anecdote, a strange moment that defied understanding. This story is unsettling because it challenges the reliability of perception. It suggests that under the right conditions, entire populations can experience the same thing without a physical cause. Not because they are foolish, but because they are human. We like to believe that our senses are trustworthy, that what we perceive corresponds directly to reality. But history reminds us that perception is filtered through context, emotion, and expectation. When fear enters the system, perception changes. The phantom odor outbreak forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. That reality is not always external. That experiences can be shared without a shared cause. That belief can shape sensation. And that once enough people agree that something exists, it begins to function as if it does. This does not mean that everything is imaginary. It means that human experience is fragile, easily influenced, easily synchronized. The smell was not real in the chemical sense, but it was real in every way that mattered to those who lived through it. This story feels unbelievable because it sits between categories. It is not superstition, not illness, not deception. It occupies an uncomfortable space where psychology and physiology intersect. Modern minds resist this ambiguity. We want clear answers. History often refuses to give them. As we move forward, the strangeness does not diminish. In fact, it intensifies. Because the next story does not involve mass perception or psychological influence, it involves a single mistake, a simple administrative error, and the unbelievable consequences that followed when one child was placed in a position no child should ever occupy. Because sometimes history does not unravel due to madness or fear. Sometimes it unravels because someone wrote the wrong name. The child who became ruler because of a mistake. It began with paperwork. No prophecy, No rebellion, no dramatic betrayal, just ink on parchment, signatures written by tired hands, and an assumption that someone else had checked the details. In monarchies, succession was meant to be sacred and precise. Bloodlines were traced carefully. Titles were inherited according to strict rules. But history is filled with moments where systems designed to prevent chaos quietly failed, and when they failed, the consequences were enormous. In one such moment, a child became a ruler. Not because he was chosen, not because he was prepared, but because a mistake went unnoticed. The child was barely old enough to understand authority, let alone wield it. He did not campaign. He did not seek power. Power simply arrived at his doorstep, wrapped in ceremony and expectation. To the adults around him, the situation was awkward but manageable. They told themselves that regents would guide him, advisors would decide for him. Time would pass, and order would remain intact. This was the illusion. In reality, placing a child at the center of political machinery destabilized everything. The child did not understand treaties. He did not grasp the consequences of decrees. He reacted emotionally, instinctively, sometimes unpredictably. Decisions were delayed or made impulsively. Advisors argued behind closed doors, each attempting to shape policy through influence rather than authority. Power became fragmented. Rival factions emerged, each claiming to act in the ruler's best interest while advancing their own agendas. Every order issued in the child's name carried ambiguity. Was it truly his will or someone else's manipulation? The population watched in confusion. To question the ruler was treason. To obey the ruler was risky. This tension eroded trust in governance. The mistake that placed the child on the throne was never publicly acknowledged. Doing so would have undermined legitimacy. Instead, officials doubled down. They performed ceremonies, issued proclamations, reinforced the illusion of continuity. The child was dressed in symbols of authority far larger than his body. Crown, robes, titles heavy with centuries of expectation. But symbols cannot replace understanding. As years passed, consequences accumulated. Policies contradicted one another. Foreign powers exploited the uncertainty. Internal unrest grew. Decisions made in the name of the child ruler reshaped lives across the kingdom, and the child himself paid a price. Raised in isolation, burdened by responsibility he never asked for, he learned early that his emotions were dangerous. That trust was conditional. That affection was strategic. His childhood disappeared beneath protocol. What makes this story so unsettling is not just the error, but how long it persisted. Adults recognized the problem. They saw the instability. But admitting the mistake felt more dangerous than continuing it. So they continued. This is a recurring theme in history. Systems often prioritize appearance over correction. Once authority is publicly declared, reversing it becomes politically impossible. The cost of admitting error outweighs the cost of enduring dysfunction. The child ruler became a symbol of that dysfunction. When decisions failed, blame quietly shifted. Advisors accused one another. Ministers resigned. Policies were rewritten, but the root cause remained untouched. The mistake stayed buried. From a modern perspective, the situation seems absurd. How could an entire society allow governance to rest on such fragile foundations? How could no one intervene? But the answer lies in fear. Fear of instability, fear of rebellion, fear of admitting that the system itself was flawed. In many historical societies, legitimacy mattered more than competence. A ruler's authority came not from ability but from tradition. Breaking tradition risked unraveling everything. So people endured. They adjusted expectations. They normalized inconsistency. They learned to read between the lines of decrees. Life went on under a ruler who barely understood it. Eventually, the truth emerged. Whether through death, deposition, or reform, the era ended. Historians later traced the chaos back to that initial error. A wrong assumption, a name unchecked, a lineage misunderstood. The story lingers because it reveals how fragile systems can be, how much trust we place in process, and how easily that trust can be misplaced. It also challenges the idea that power is always seized deliberately. Sometimes power is inherited accidentally, and when it is, it exposes the weakness of structures meant to contain it. This child did not fail the kingdom. The system failed the child, and the kingdom paid the price. As we move forward, the next story will take us away from palaces and paperwork and into something far more intimate. Not governance, not law, but the human body itself, because history is filled with moments where people believed that altering their bodies was worth the risk, worth the pain, worth their lives. And in the next story, beauty will become something far more dangerous than it appears. When human difference became public entertainment, at first people did not call it cruelty. They called it curiosity. The posters promised wonder. Something rare, something extraordinary. A chance to see what most people would never encounter in their lifetime. Families gathered. Children were brought along. Coins exchanged hands. Curtains were pulled back. And someone stepped into the light. Human difference has always existed. Bodies vary. Minds develop in unpredictable ways. Nature does not produce uniformity. But there were moments in history when difference stopped being understood as variation and started being treated as spectacle. In those moments, human beings became exhibits. Traveling shows moved from town to town, carrying people rather than animals. Individuals with unusual bodies, conditions, or appearances were placed on stages, inside tents, behind glass. They were advertised with exaggerated language. Monsters, marvels, living curiosities. Crowds gathered not out of malice, but fascination. They stared, they whispered, they pointed, and slowly something shifted. What began as curiosity turned into normalization. The presence of a human being on display stopped feeling strange. The discomfort faded. The spectacle became entertainment. This is what makes the phenomenon so disturbing. It did not rely on violence. It relied on repetition. Over time, the audience stopped seeing a person. They saw a feature. The individuals on display were often introduced by their differences alone. Their names were secondary, their histories irrelevant, their inner lives ignored. They were defined entirely by what made them unusual. And yet, these were not passive victims without agency. Many of them participated willingly, at least at first. Options were limited, employment scarce, survival difficult. For some, exhibition was the only way to earn a living. This complicates the story. It forces us to acknowledge that exploitation does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like opportunity in a world with few alternatives. Still, the power imbalance was undeniable. Promoters controlled narratives, they wrote scripts, they shaped perception, they decided how much humanity was allowed to show through. Audiences rarely questioned what they were seeing. They trusted the framing. If the poster said curiosity, then curiosity was what they felt. If it said oddity, then oddity was what they perceived. Language shaped experience. Children grew up seeing these exhibitions as normal. Parents explained them matter-of-factly. Teachers referenced them casually. Society absorbed the idea that difference existed to be observed, not understood. This absorption is what allowed the practice to persist. Behind the curtains, life was far less theatrical. Long hours, constant scrutiny, invasive questions, bodies treated as objects of measurement, privacy non-existent. Some performers reported feeling invisible even while being stared at, their existence reduced to surface. What makes this story so uncomfortable is how ordinary it became. These exhibitions were not hidden. They were public, advertised, accepted. They existed in the same cities that built libraries and universities, in the same eras that celebrated progress and enlightenment. This contradiction reveals something important about human morality. Progress does not move evenly. Society can advance intellectually while remaining emotionally stagnant. Knowledge can increase while empathy lags behind. The people who attended these exhibitions were not necessarily cruel. Many believed they were learning something, experiencing the diversity of the human condition. But learning without empathy becomes consumption, and consumption, when applied to people, erodes dignity. The decline of these exhibitions did not happen overnight. It took changing attitudes, new language, legal pressure, growing discomfort. Society slowly began to recognize what had been normalized. That recognition did not erase the damage. Those who lived as exhibits carried lasting scars, not just physical, but psychological. Being constantly watched changes a person. Being reduced to a feature distorts self-perception. Even after the exhibitions faded, their influence remained. Stereotypes persisted. Curiosity lingered. The line between interest and objectification remained blurred. This story forces us to confront a difficult truth. The past is not distant. The instinct to categorize, display, and consume difference still exists. It simply wears different clothing. Digital platforms, viral content, algorithms that reward attention without context. The stages are new, the impulse is old. When we look back at these exhibitions, it is tempting to feel moral superiority, to assume we would never participate in such behavior, to believe that we have moved beyond it. History suggests caution. What feels acceptable now may feel horrifying later. And what feels educational may be exploitative in disguise. This story is not about condemning individuals. It is about recognizing patterns, about understanding how easily humanity can be sidelined when curiosity goes unchecked. As we move forward, the next story will take us into a different kind of danger. One that people actively sought out, not for money or survival, but for excitement. Because there were times when risking death itself became a form of entertainment, and people lined up to play. When playing with death became a game. At first, it was described as courage. Not the quiet kind born of necessity, but a louder, more performative bravery, the kind that demanded witnesses, the kind that needed applause to feel real. Young men gathered in open spaces, taverns, fields, town squares. Word spread quickly when a challenge was announced. People arrived early to secure a good view. Bets were placed. Jokes were made. Death, for a moment, felt distant. The rules were simple, too simple. Participants would test their luck against danger, sometimes with weapons, sometimes with heights, sometimes with speed, fire, or suffocation. The specifics varied, but the premise remained the same. Prove you are fearless. These were not accidents, they were games. And that distinction matters because when danger is framed as entertainment, it becomes desirable. It becomes something to seek rather than avoid. The crowd's presence transformed risk into spectacle, fear into excitement. Those who participated felt pressure, not always spoken, but deeply understood. To hesitate was to be mocked. To refuse was to be forgotten. Reputation was currency, and courage was its most valuable form. People did not participate because they wanted to die. They participated because they wanted to be seen. Some games involved duels with minimal protection. Others required feats of endurance that pushed bodies beyond safe limits. There were contests of breath-holding, drinking, exposure to cold, and violent physical trials. Medical knowledge was limited, recovery uncertain, injury common. Still, people lined up. What makes this phenomenon so unsettling is not the danger itself, but how socially reinforced it was. These games were not hidden. They were public, celebrated, sometimes even encouraged by local leaders who saw them as displays of strength or discipline. Risk-taking became ritualized. The crowd's reaction shaped behavior. Cheers intensified actions. Laughter minimized injury. Silence signaled disappointment. The participants fed off this energy, pushing themselves further than they would have alone. Group psychology took over. When people act in isolation, self-preservation dominates. In groups, perception shifts. The presence of others alters risk calculation. The desire for acceptance competes with the instinct to survive. This competition does not always end well. In many recorded instances, participants died, sometimes immediately, sometimes days later from complications. These deaths were rarely treated as tragedies in the modern sense. They were framed as unfortunate outcomes of bold behavior, martyrdom without cause. The community mourned briefly, then moved on. Another challenge would be announced. Another crowd would gather. The game continued. Why did this persist? Part of the answer lies in boredom. In eras where daily life was rigid and repetitive, moments of excitement were rare. These games broke monotony. They offered intensity in otherwise constrained lives. But boredom alone does not explain willingness to flirt with death. Social validation played a larger role. In tightly knit communities, reputation mattered deeply. To be known as brave was to hold status. To be known as cautious was to risk invisibility. Fear of insignificance can be more powerful than fear of death. This is difficult to accept from a modern perspective. We like to believe that survival is the strongest instinct. But history shows that meaning often outranks safety. People will risk everything to feel important. Authorities occasionally intervened, bans were issued, warnings posted, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some leaders quietly tolerated the games, seeing them as outlets for aggression or ways to reinforce hierarchy. Others participated indirectly, attending as spectators. When authority watches without stopping, legitimacy is implied. Over time, the games evolved. Some became formalized. Rules were added. Equipment improved slightly. This gave an illusion of safety. Participants felt protected by structure, even when danger remained extreme. Structure can make risk feel reasonable. That illusion is dangerous. The decline of these practices came slowly. As medical understanding improved and legal responsibility expanded, tolerance for recreational death decreased. Accidents became liabilities. Entertainment lost its justification. But the instinct did not disappear. It transformed. Modern society still celebrates risk. Extreme sports, dangerous challenges, viral dares. The difference is not desire, but framing. Risk is now marketed as controlled, managed, insured, yet fatalities still occur. The line between bravery and recklessness remains thin. This story unsettles us because it reveals how easily danger can be normalized when wrapped in applause. How death can become background noise when excitement dominates. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Why do crowds encourage behavior individuals would avoid alone? Why does validation feel worth the risk? And how often do we mistake recklessness for courage? The people who participated in these games were not suicidal. They were human, social, desperate for recognition. They believed they were playing. History shows us the cost of that belief. As we move into the next story, the focus will shift again, away from public spectacle and into the realm of false certainty. Because the next danger did not come from thrill-seeking or entertainment. It came from ideas that claimed to be scientific, ideas that promised understanding, and instead caused harm on a massive scale. When pseudoscience became a social obsession, at first it looked like progress. People gathered in lecture halls and salons, notebooks open, eyes attentive. Charts were drawn, measurements taken, numbers recorded with confidence. The language was calm, authoritative, and reassuring. This was science, they were told, not superstition, not belief, not tradition, evidence. The idea was simple enough to feel elegant. Human behavior, intelligence, morality, even destiny could be measured, quantified, compared. If the right features were studied carefully enough, society could finally understand itself. Order would replace chaos. What followed was one of the most unsettling periods in intellectual history, when pseudoscience dressed itself in the language of reason and reshaped how millions of people saw one another. Skulls were measured, faces examined, bodies categorized. Minor differences were treated as profound truths. The angle of a forehead, the curve of a nose, the size of a cranium. These became indicators of character and worth. People believed it. Not because they were ignorant, but because the claims felt scientific. There were tools, diagrams, institutions supporting the work, experts explaining conclusions with confidence. Once an idea acquires authority, skepticism weakens. Families consulted these theories when making decisions about children. Educators used them to justify expectations. Governments referenced them to rationalize policies. Entire populations were ranked according to arbitrary physical traits. This ranking felt objective. That illusion made it powerful. The danger of pseudoscience lies not in its absurdity, but in its plausibility. These theories did not sound mystical. They sounded practical, efficient, helpful. They promised clarity in a complicated world, but clarity built on false assumptions becomes cruelty. People labeled as inferior faced restricted opportunities. Those deemed superior were granted unearned confidence. Bias hardened into policy. Prejudice transformed into principle. And all of it was justified with charts. What makes this story particularly chilling is how long it lasted. Decades passed before widespread challenges emerged. Even then, resistance was slow. The theories were too useful to abandon. They explained inequality without demanding change. They excused injustice without guilt when something benefits those in power. Evidence against it struggles to gain traction. The individuals promoting these ideas often believed they were helping society. They framed their work as preventative. If flaws could be identified early, they argued, suffering could be avoided. This logic was seductive. It framed discrimination as compassion. The human cost was enormous. People internalized labels placed upon them. Expectations shaped outcomes. When a child is told repeatedly that they are limited, they begin to believe it. Belief alters behavior. Behavior reinforces stereotype. A self-fulfilling cycle emerged. Breaking that cycle required more than scientific correction. It required cultural reckoning. It required acknowledging that intelligence, morality, and worth could not be reduced to measurements. That reckoning came slowly. Even after studies were debunked, their influence lingered. Language persisted. Assumptions remained. The framework survived in subtle forms. History shows us that bad ideas do not disappear when proven wrong. They fade gradually, leaving traces behind. This story feels uncomfortable because it implicates intelligence itself. It shows that education does not guarantee wisdom, that sophisticated tools can be used to justify harmful beliefs, and that certainty, when paired with authority, is dangerous. The people who accepted these ideas were not villains. They were participants in a system that rewarded confidence over caution, precision over humility. They wanted answers, and these theories provided them. This is why pseudoscience spread so effectively. It does not demand faith. It demands trust. Trust in experts, trust in institutions, trust in methods that appear rigorous. Questioning feels unnecessary. Until harm becomes undeniable. By the time these ideas were widely challenged, damage had already been done. Lives shaped, opportunities denied, histories altered. The story forces us to confront a difficult question. How many beliefs do we hold today because they feel scientific, not because they are true? And how many harms are justified in the name of certainty? History reminds us that skepticism is not cynicism, it is responsibility, that progress requires doubt as much as discovery. As we move forward, the next story will take us away from laboratories and lecture halls and into the realm of ritual, where logic mattered less than repetition, where meaning was inherited rather than questioned. Because sometimes people followed traditions not because they made sense, but because stopping felt unthinkable, and those traditions could become stranger than reason itself. When rituals became stranger than reason, at first glance, it looked like devotion. People gathered at the same places at the same times, repeating the same actions with unwavering precision. Movements were synchronized, words were recited in unison, gestures were passed down carefully, unchanged for generations. No one questioned why it had to be done this way. They only knew that it had always been done. Ritual has always played a role in human societies. It creates structure. It offers comfort. It provides meaning in the face of uncertainty. When life feels chaotic, ritual promises order. But there are moments in history when ritual stops serving humanity and begins demanding obedience instead. In these moments, reason fades quietly, replaced by repetition. Some of these rituals were physically painful. Participants endured prolonged discomfort, exposure, or injury. Others required isolation, deprivation, or extreme restraint. The acts themselves varied, but the justification was always the same. This is how it has always been done. People followed not because they understood the purpose, but because questioning felt dangerous. Tradition carried authority stronger than logic. To refuse was to risk exclusion. To doubt was to invite suspicion. Belonging depended on compliance. Children were taught these rituals before they were taught to reason. By the time they were old enough to question, the practices felt inseparable from identity. To abandon them felt like abandoning oneself. This is how rituals survive long after their original purpose is forgotten. Historical records describe communities enforcing practices that caused visible harm. Bodies weakened, minds exhausted, lives shortened, and yet the rituals continued. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Fear that stopping would invite disaster. Fear that tradition was holding something unseen at bay. Fear that abandoning the ritual would unravel the fragile balance of existence. In societies where survival depended on forces beyond human control, weather, disease, famine, ritual became a way to feel involved, to believe that action could influence outcome. The problem arises when belief becomes obligation. Once ritual is tied to moral worth, refusing becomes more than disagreement. It becomes defiance, and defiance threatens cohesion. So the group enforces compliance, not always violently, often gently, through shame, through expectation, through repetition. People endure because everyone else does. This dynamic creates a powerful illusion of necessity. When everyone participates, it feels impossible that the practice could be meaningless. Collective participation reinforces belief, and belief reinforces action. Over time, the ritual becomes disconnected from its origin. The reason for its existence fades, but the action remains. What began as symbolic becomes literal. What began as optional becomes mandatory. The ritual no longer explains itself. It simply demands continuation. What makes these practices especially unsettling is how calmly they were accepted. Participants did not view themselves as victims. They saw themselves as caretakers of tradition, protectors of balance, contributors to something larger than individual comfort. Pain was reframed as duty. Suffering became proof of commitment. Those who endured were praised. Those who questioned were pitied or condemned. This inversion of logic allowed harmful practices to persist for centuries. From a modern perspective, these rituals appear extreme, even absurd, but judging them solely through contemporary values misses the deeper lesson. Humans crave meaning. When meaning is scarce, tradition fills the gap, and once tradition becomes sacred, logic loses its authority. History shows that rituals do not need to make sense to survive. They only need to feel necessary, and necessity is often constructed through fear. Fear of divine punishment, fear of social rejection, fear of chaos. These fears are powerful motivators. They can override empathy, override reason, override instinct. People will do almost anything if they believe the alternative is worse. Eventually, some rituals faded, not because they were questioned openly, but because circumstances changed. External pressures disrupted the cycle. New beliefs replaced old ones. Authority shifted, but the process was slow, and traces remained. Even after rituals disappeared, their logic survived in subtle forms: repetition without understanding, compliance without questioning, actions justified by tradition rather than purpose. This story unsettles us because it reveals how easily meaning can be outsourced, how readily people surrender judgment when belonging is at stake. It also raises an uncomfortable question. How many rituals do we follow today without understanding why? How many actions are justified simply because they are familiar? History reminds us that tradition is not inherently wise. It is persistent, and persistence should never be confused with truth. As we move toward the final story, the focus shifts once more, away from ritual and into something even more unsettling. Because the next event did not rely on belief or tradition, it relied on imitation. On the way, human behavior spreads quietly, invisibly from one person to another, until suddenly an entire population is moving in the same direction, not because they chose to, but because everyone else already was. When human behavior became contagious, it never begins with chaos. That is the mistake people make when they imagine mass behavior spiraling out of control. They picture screaming crowds, sudden violence, obvious panic. But history shows something far more unsettling. It begins quietly. One person does something unusual, not dramatic, not violent, just different enough to be noticed. A gesture, a movement, a reaction, something slightly out of place. Others watch. Most do nothing. But a few imitate, not because they are instructed to, not because they fully understand what they are copying. They imitate because imitation feels safe, familiar, socially acceptable, and once imitation begins, it accelerates. This is how some of the strangest moments in history unfolded. Entire populations behaving in synchronized, irrational ways without clear leadership, without central coordination, without shared intent. Historians have documented events where groups suddenly adopted behaviors that spread faster than reason could contain them. People fainted en masse, laughed uncontrollably, ran without knowing why, believed things that contradicted direct evidence. The most disturbing part is not the behavior itself, it is how normal it felt to those involved. Participants did not experience themselves as irrational. They felt aligned, supported, surrounded by confirmation. When everyone around you reacts the same way, doubt feels unnecessary. This is the psychology of contagion. Humans are deeply wired to mirror one another. Facial expressions, emotional tone, posture, behavior. These signals synchronize groups unconsciously. In stable conditions, this creates cohesion. In unstable conditions, it creates amplification. Fear spreads. Excitement spreads. Belief spreads. Once a critical mass is reached, behavior becomes self-sustaining. No one needs to explain it anymore. The action itself becomes justification. History offers chilling examples. Cities where panic erupted without a visible threat. Towns where people fled en masse based on rumors that later proved false. Communities where violence spread not from ideology but from momentum. People did not ask, "Is this true?" They asked, "Why is everyone else reacting?" And that question is dangerous. Because once behavior becomes the primary source of information, reality loses authority. In some cases, authorities attempted to intervene. Announcements were made, explanations offered, reassurances issued. But these efforts often failed. Why? Because words travel slower than emotion, and emotion had already taken control. People trust what they see others doing more than what they are told. When fear spreads visually, rational explanation feels abstract, distant, unconvincing. This is how crowds move faster than facts. What makes these events so hard to understand is that participants were not acting out of malice. They were responding to social cues, the same mechanisms that allow cooperation, empathy, and culture to exist. These mechanisms do not distinguish between truth and momentum. They only detect consensus. Once consensus forms, behavior aligns. This is why mass behavior is so difficult to stop once it begins. Individual resistance feels isolating. Standing still while others move feels risky. Speaking calmly while others panic feels naive. The cost of dissent rises. So people join, even when they feel uncertain, even when they feel afraid, even when they feel something is wrong. History records moments where this process led to tragedy, where innocent people were harmed, where communities turned on themselves, where destruction occurred without a clear instigator. Afterwards, survivors struggled to explain what had happened. "I don't know why I did it. It just felt like what everyone was doing. There wasn't time to think." These statements appear again and again in historical accounts, not as excuses but as genuine confusion. Participants often experience their own actions as automatic. Agency dissolved into movement. This loss of agency is what makes mass behavior so terrifying. It reveals how thin the line is between individual decision and collective impulse. We like to believe we are independent thinkers. History repeatedly challenges that belief. Under pressure, humans defer to the group, not consciously but instinctively. The group becomes a signal of safety even when it is wrong. This instinct once helped us survive. In modern societies, it can destroy us. The most unsettling realization is this: mass behavior does not require ignorance. It does not require low intelligence. It does not require coercion. It only requires uncertainty and visibility. When people are unsure what to believe, they look to others. When they see others acting decisively, they follow. Confidence spreads faster than accuracy. And once the movement begins, it gains its own momentum. History teaches us that the end of these events often comes not through reason, but exhaustion. The crowd disperses, attention shifts, energy fades. Only then does reflection return, and with reflection comes shame. People ask how they could have participated, how they could have believed, how they could have acted without thinking. The answer is uncomfortable. Because the same mechanisms exist today. Technology has not removed them. It has accelerated them. Information spreads faster. Images reach wider audiences. Behavior becomes visible instantly. Contagion travels at unprecedented speed. The past warns us not because it was different, but because it was the same. Different clothes, different tools, same instincts. This final story does not end with a clear resolution, because mass behavior is not an anomaly. It is a recurring feature of human societies. It emerges when fear meets uncertainty, when visibility meets imitation, when belonging feels safer than doubt. History does not record these moments to shame us. It records them to remind us that thinking is fragile, that independence requires effort, that awareness must be practiced, and that the most dangerous movements rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They simply feel normal. As the crowd moves, the individual disappears, and by the time anyone asks why, the moment has already passed. What remains is memory, and the uneasy knowledge that if conditions align again, history may repeat itself, not because we failed to learn, but because we forgot how easily we can follow. When these stories end, there is often a strange silence, not because there is nothing left to say, but because the mind needs time to catch up with what it has just heard. Each story feels isolated while you listen to it. A strange event, a bizarre decision, an unbelievable moment in the past. But taken together, they form something far more unsettling. A pattern. None of these events happened because people were foolish. They did not occur because humanity was less intelligent, less moral, or less capable than it is today. They happened because the people involved were responding to their world as it existed in that moment. They were responding to pressure, to fear, to uncertainty, to authority, to the behavior of those around them, and above all, to the need for meaning. History often feels distant because we flatten it into timelines and summaries. We treat it as a sequence of resolved events, but when you slow down and listen closely, history feels uncomfortably familiar. People normalize things that now feel impossible to accept. They participated in systems that harmed others without questioning them. They trusted ideas that later proved disastrous. They followed crowds even when instinct whispered that something was wrong, not because they were evil, but because they were human. This is the truth that makes strange history so difficult to dismiss. It does not allow us to stand above the past with confidence. It forces us to stand beside it. When we hear about dancing until death, we want to believe we would stop. When we hear about judging the dead, we want to believe we would object. When we hear about spectacle, ritual, pseudoscience, and mass behavior, we want to believe we would resist. But belief is easy in hindsight. History does not test us when outcomes are clear. It tests us when certainty is absent. The people in these stories did not wake up believing they were participating in something absurd. They acted within systems that rewarded compliance and punished doubt. They trusted authority. They trusted tradition. They trusted the group. And when something strange became common enough, it stopped feeling strange at all. That is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. Normality is not fixed. It is negotiated. What feels unthinkable today may feel ordinary tomorrow if enough people accept it without resistance. And what feels harmless may reveal its cost only after it has taken root. History does not repeat itself in identical forms. It adapts. It disguises itself. It reappears in new languages, new technologies, new structures. But the underlying mechanisms remain. Fear still spreads faster than reason. Authority still silences doubt. Belonging still competes with conscience. And humans still look to one another for cues on how to behave when the world feels uncertain. These stories are not meant to make you distrust history. They are meant to make you respect it, to recognize that progress is fragile, that reason requires maintenance, that skepticism is not cynicism but responsibility. Understanding the past does not immunize us against repeating it, but ignoring it guarantees that we will. Strange history matters not because it entertains, but because it warns. It reminds us that truth does not always arrive neatly packaged, that reality can feel uncomfortable, contradictory, and deeply unsettling. And that is precisely when it demands our attention. If there is a single thread connecting all of these stories, it is this. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. That adaptability has allowed us to survive famine, war, and collapse, but it has also allowed us to normalize suffering, justify cruelty, and follow momentum into disaster. Adaptation without reflection is dangerous. History gives us reflection. It does not ask us to judge the past harshly. It asks us to examine ourselves honestly, to question where our certainty comes from, to ask why we believe what we believe, and to notice when something strange begins to feel normal, because that is always the first warning sign. As you step away from these stories, you may feel unsettled. That is not an accident. Discomfort is often the beginning of awareness. It signals that something has challenged a deeply held assumption. Sit with it. Let the questions linger. Not every story needs closure. Not every mystery needs resolution. Sometimes the value lies in recognizing that reality is more complex than we want it to be. History does not exist to comfort us. It exists to remind us that we are capable of brilliance and blindness in equal measure, that progress is uneven, that certainty is seductive, and that the line between reason and absurdity is thinner than we like to believe. The past is not a warning from another world. It is a mirror, and the longer you look into it, the harder it becomes to pretend that the reflection has nothing to do with you. Thank you for listening, and remember, if something feels too strange to be true, history has taught us one thing with unsettling consistency: it might be real.